Hello everybody, my name is Charles Peer and I am a pastel painter that lives and works in the beautiful little town of Salem Springs, Arkansas. A couple of weeks ago, the Oklahoma Pastel Society contacted me and asked me if I would do a landscape demo for them. And I got to tell you, I was thrilled and excited and very honored to be able to do this for them. They were also gracious enough to allow me to share this video with others. So, this is it. Now, I have to make a little bit of a disclaimer here because since we are all experienced this terrible COVID pandemic isolation, I am doing this whole thing solo here. So not only will I be painting, but I'm also doing the videoing, which is, I gotta tell you, way above my pay grade. So here we go. I hope that it works out okay and that you find some of this information interesting and that you find it maybe inspiring or gives you something to think about, a new way of looking at something, and excitement of going up to your easel and trying something new. So there's the studio. Let's go get busy. Welcome to the studio. Now, before we get started with the actual painting, I thought that it might be helpful for me to explain to you how I select a subject matter for the paintings. The thing that I am most interested in is recording my interpretation of the way the light hits an object or a venue. I am not particularly interested in the scenic value of the location, but I am interested in the dramatic way light affects that space or those objects. So what I look for is a interesting light effect. Now, when light illuminates an object or a space, it can do several different things. One, it can emphasize the texture. It can also alter what we think of as the local color in dramatic ways. Another thing it can do is emphasize shapes or patterns that we might have otherwise overlooked. So these are the things that kind of stop me in my track and cause me to pull out my iPhone and start taking pictures. Now, I take lots of bad pictures, and I think that in some way allows me to be a more creative artist because I do not feel slavish to some great photograph. And so I really do like the idea that we think of the photograph as a photo reference, just a reference. It is my jumping off place to do something new and creative. The photograph is not that great, so I am not trying to replicate that. I only want it as my source of inspiration and a reference point. So, the other night, when Toby and I were out for our evening walk, this is Toby, he's my little furball friend and studio partner. So when we were out for our walk the other night, we came across this scene, just a few blocks from where we live. And I was immediately struck by the warmth of the light hitting that tree and the side of that abandoned house over there. So I pulled out the phone, snapped about a dozen pictures, and used bits and pieces of them to come up with the idea for what this for this painting, this demo. So this is my setup. My work table. I have my easel right next to my photo reference. My easel. And then on the easel is mounted a piece of UART 400 grit paper. Next to it is a very small thumbnail color palette, which helps me determine some of the color combinations and the layering that I want to do. Above that is a black and white and one value of gray compositional study. And then the paper down here. And of course I have to first think about what's the star of the show. Where's the focal area? Not the point, but the focal area. And for me, it's this tree, of course, set off to the right just a little bit, and the vegetation that kind of meanders down. The supporting actor in this show is the little house that's abandoned and sits a little further back. And then bringing your eye up to this area will be these passages of sunlight that goes across the shadowy area. So this is my charcoal sketch. I use soft vine charcoal to do this. And I developed the charcoal sketch fairly far because I want to establish those darks, really darks, the middle values, and then the lights. So I use a couple of tools. I have one spray bottle that has rubbing alcohol in it, one spray bottle that has water in it, and I use one of those depending on the look. This will sort of soften the charcoal just like it does your new pastel, and you can move it around like paint with a little bit of water on top of that for either the new pastel or the charcoal. It almost creates some interesting runs and textures. I use a Jack Richardson Gray Matter brush number 6. This one I've just about used up. It's pretty worn, so it's time to get a new one of these. But at this point, it's fun. You don't know exactly what you're going to get. It's kind of like jumping off a cliff. This could be really exciting, or you could crash and burn. But here we go. So I want to create some texture here. So I'm going to start with a little bit of this rubbing alcohol. I also have a little plastic dish that I will dip it in, and I can move some of this around. Just like you do your underpainting if you are using, say, a hard pastel like a new pastel. Kind of gets them going fluid. I use this brush holding it far to the end so it becomes a little bit more painterly. I like to let the runs happen. And you'll notice that even sometimes I'm going up with it, and, or the direction of the surface. But if I want the feeling of grasses and things like that, I might go up. All right, now that that has started to kind of move around, I'm going to shoot it with a little bit of water, mostly just so that you can see the effect. And it doesn't really mix that well with the alcohol, so you do get these very interesting runs. You can actually almost wash off the work that you've done, so you have to be a little bit careful. I do use paper towels, so if I do have some falling into areas that I just think, oh no, that's just not working how I wanted it to work, I can blot it. Sometimes I will lay this down on a table at maybe a 30-degree angle so that it doesn't run quite so quickly and so much. But oftentimes I think that this kind of lends itself to almost feeling like more vegetation back there. Tree limbs and trunks and things like that. And of course, I can continue to work it. As we all know, the alcohol dries really quite quickly, and the water actually does dry pretty fast as well. So we're going to let that dry just a second. I do sometimes use a hair dryer to speed things along, especially if it's starting to run in places that I don't really want it to run, or if it's very cold and humid and I just want to speed the process along a little faster. So this is dry now, and before I go any further, I want to take the charcoal back into it and reestablish some of the what I think are pretty important lines that I want to keep, and maybe even deepen the value of some of this. So I'm going back in using this soft vine charcoal. Doing a little bit of negative painting or drawing. Still keeping it pretty loose. Now there are times when you can even go back if you want and spray it some more. Get some more texture going if that's what you feel like it needs or wants. I don't think I'm going to necessarily do that. I will smudge here and there, and all right. Now, the next step will be to start doing the underpainting with a new pastel. It's similar techniques actually, but I don't want this texture and these values and the pigment of the black charcoal to mix with the color of the new pastel. So I am going to spray it. I am using the Krylon Fine Art Fixative. And I will spray that as well. I will dry that as well. Okay, so the charcoal part of the drawing is done. So now I'm going to start adding the color that will become the underpainting. And this is similar to the way many people do it. I'm using new pastels primarily. Sometimes I do use some Ludwig's in there if it's a particular color that I want. I am focusing on value. I've already established a pretty strong value here. At this point, the color is not as important as the value is. And so you can be playful with it. I do oftentimes try to think of colors that will sit nicely underneath the more local color or the top color. So I am putting some of this in. continually thinking about how color will react to what's below it and what's above it. So again, right now I am establishing some darks. I want this side to be cooler. I want this side to be warmer because I'm wanting this light to come over here, kind of sink all this further back, maybe give a little bit more of the sense of this being illuminated like the house is. So I'm working pretty quickly. Like I said, it's not all that critical. This is really kind of a fun time because you really hadn't lost anything if it all goes south. Keeping in mind cools and warms, and that cools are going to recede. As we all know, warms are going to advance. But also, as I said earlier, more than anything else, it's getting the value. Emphasizing the structure through value. I have my new pastels laid out to my right. I said, the color is not near as crucial as the values, getting those values. So this is a wonderful time to just play. I love this stage because it's just almost, you almost can abandon um, your thought of what is this going to wind up looking like in the end? Because at this point, I'm laying down color that will come through in bits and pieces, but it won't be all that critical. Because most of it will get covered in some way, but it is laying that foundation for all of that. I'm working pretty quickly here, maybe a little faster than I would normally work, but not a lot. I want to expedite this so that it's a little bit more interesting to you, not as time demanding. This will be the area of vegetation back here that, as I said, will be hit a little bit with the light passing through this area, hitting the house and illuminating some of this a little bit. Okay, so now let's add the rubbing alcohol to this. I got my paper towels ready. I have my brush ready. In one hand, I have the little dish of rubbing alcohol and the rubbing alcohol in this spray bottle. I've chosen these two spray bottles because they spray the liquid differently. And I have just played around, experimented till I have found two that I really like the way it applies the liquid. I am at this point thinking a little bit about edges, particularly getting those soft edges when I want a harder edge. Sometimes I'll even go back into the area to establish a really hard edge. But this is very good for kind of creating these very soft edges for trees and anything that has that kind of lost edge. Again, trying to hold the brush far back so I have a little bit less control. I generally start with some of the lighter areas because the color does get pretty, pretty muted, pretty dirty, you might think. But to me, that's a nice foundation because it does serve as almost a neutral many times. I don't always start from the bottom or the top. It just kind of seems uh, to dictate it on its own. I started at the bottom this time simply because most of the light area was right into here, and I wanted to kind of get that established before everything got pretty mixed and dirty. And so kind of lay that in there, leave it. I'm going to go to the tree because in the house, because they're kind of the next light areas. It's running down through there, and that's okay with me. I'm going to go to the house, just blocking in. That's all I'm doing, blocking in. I forgot to lay any color here, so I'm going to put that down, and you can. A bit of Ludwig there. So I'm both dipping my brush into that dish of alcohol, and I'm also spraying it on. Working pretty quickly. I do try to think about the direction that my strokes are going. I think that sometimes really will already establish a texture or indicate what an object might be, how it's constructed. So whether, as I said, it's grass and it's going up, or whether it's foliage and I'm kind of working, feathering it out. Now there's some beautiful drips right here, and I don't really want to lose those, so I'm barely touching uh, barely touching the surface with the brush. I'm almost just dragging it, trying to leave some of that. If I have a particular drip that's creating an edge there that I don't really like, I can start to eliminate that or soften it. Keep wiping my brush on the paper towel in my left hand. Same way with the texture here. This is very interesting, I think. So I'm adding a little bit of color, letting some of that. I have no idea how much of that will actually wind up being there in the end. But at this point, I'm trying to leave it as best I can, and then I'll make that decision as the painting develops. So warming up all of the colors in this area. Okay, now we're going to give that a little bit of time, maybe hit it with the hair dryer just to speed things along.